This is the story of Operation Blücher, an attack so unexpected that it changed the battle map in a single night. To understand what happened that day, we have to go back to the summer of 1944. When the Allies landed in Normandy, German troops began retreating across France. But one group of soldiers didn't run. They stayed in Dunkirk, the same city where the British had escaped 4 years earlier. On April 5, 1945, while Hitler was hiding in his Berlin bunker and Soviet troops were marching toward the heart of Germany, something impossible happened in France. At 5 in the morning, thousands of German soldiers jumped from their trenches in Dunkirk and attacked the Allied lines. They weren't retreating, they weren't surrendering. They were attacking. It was the last German offensive on French territory, and no one saw it coming. Dunkirk had become a German fortress. More than 12,000 soldiers from the 226th Infantry Division, along with Marines and coastal gunners, had dug deep trenches around the entire city. Their commander was Admiral Friedrich Frisius, a war veteran who had decided to resist until the end. The Allies completely surrounded them in September 1944, but Frisius did not surrender. 4 months, the German garrison lived completely isolated. No reinforcements arrived, insufficient food arrived, no news from the outside arrived. The Allies thought it was only a matter of time before they surrendered from hunger. But Frisius had other plans. While the Canadians and Czechs stood guard around the perimeter, he prepared something no one expected. The situation in April 1945 was desperate for Germany. The Red Army had crossed the Oder River and was only 60 kilometers from Berlin. The Americans were advancing from the south, the British from the north. The war was practically lost. In any civilized place, German commanders would have surrendered. But Frisius was not a normal commander. On April 4th, Frisius gathered his officers and announced the most audacious operation of their careers. They weren't going to wait for defeat sitting down. They were going to attack. They called it Operation Blücher, after the Prussian general who had helped defeat Napoleon. It was a perfect name for what would be the German army's last war cry in France. The night of April 4th to 5th, everything was silent on the Allied lines. Canadian and Czech soldiers had spent months watching the same German trenches, waiting for them to finally surrender. Some weren't even paying much attention anymore. After all, what could some surrounded Germans do against all Allied power? At 5 a.m. on April 5th, hell broke loose. German artillery began bombarding Allied positions with an intensity no one had seen in months. It was as if all the fury accumulated during the siege had exploded at once. Shells fell like rain on Canadian and Czech trenches. While explosions lit up the sky, thousands of German soldiers came out screaming from their positions. It wasn't a desperate retreat or a surrender. It was a full-scale attack, coordinated and fierce. The Germans threw themselves against Allied lines with bayonets, grenades, and machine guns, as if it were 1940 again. The attack was so unexpected that Allied commanders thought it was a joke. A British officer received the report by radio and responded, "Repeat that. The Germans are attacking." When they confirmed the news, the surprise was total. For months they had maintained a relaxed siege, waiting for a surrender. Now they had a pitched battle on their hands. The Germans advanced 15 kilometers in the first hours. They broke Canadian lines at 3 different points and captured dozens of prisoners. The Allies didn't know how to react. Some commanders ordered all bridges within a 40-kilometer radius to be blown up, thinking the Germans were going to try to escape eastward. But Frisius had no intention of escaping. His plan was different. He wanted to expand Dunkirk's perimeter, capture more territory and demonstrate that the Germans could still fight. It was an act of pure military rebellion, a final challenge against inevitable fate. His soldiers fought like possessed, advancing village by village. News of the attack reached London and Washington. Newspapers headlined, "Germans attack in France while Berlin falls." It was surreal. In the east, the Red Army was bombarding the German capital. In the west, a handful of German soldiers had decided they weren't defeated yet. For 3 days, the battle raged around Dunkirk. The Germans consolidated their new positions, dug trenches and prepared to resist. The Allies, once recovered from the initial surprise, began to counterattack. But it was too late to completely stop the German advance. The most incredible thing of all was that the Germans were gaining territory while their country was collapsing. On April 12, Franklin Roosevelt died in the United States. On April 16, the Soviets began the final assault against Berlin. On April 20th, it was Hitler's last birthday. And in Dunkirk, German soldiers continued fighting as if nothing had changed. Operation Blücher technically ended on April 8, but the Germans maintained the captured territory. For almost another month, they defended their new positions against all Allied counterattacks. It was like a war within another war, a miniature conflict that continued while the rest of the world prepared for peace. Frisius even managed to receive supplies during the siege. The Germans sent 28 Seehund-type mini-submarines from their bases in the North Sea. These small two-crew submarines normally carried torpedoes, but they modified them to transport food, ammunition, and medicine. It was a supply operation as risky as it was desperate. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. On May 2nd, Berlin fell to the Soviets. On May 8th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. World War II had officially ended in Europe. But in Dunkirk, the shooting continued one more day. Frisius finally surrendered on May 9, 1945, one day after the official end of the war. He handed over his sword to Czechoslovak General Alois Liska in a formal ceremony. He had kept 12,000 German soldiers fighting until literally the last possible day. It was the end of a resistance that had lasted 8 months. Operation Blücher became the last German offensive on French territory. It was an act of pure defiance, militarily unnecessary but symbolically powerful. Frisius and his men had demonstrated that some soldiers fight to the end, no matter how lost the cause. When historians studied the operation years later, they were surprised by its audacity. At a time when everyone expected the Germans to surrender, they decided to attack. When the whole world knew the war was lost, these soldiers chose to write one last page of resistance. The story of Operation Blücher teaches us something about human nature in the most desperate moments. Some surrender when all seems lost. Others decide to fight one more battle, win one more day, resist one more minute. Frisius and his soldiers chose the second option, and that's why their story deserves to be remembered. The soldiers who participated in Operation Blücher came from all over Germany. There were veterans who had fought in Poland, France, and Russia. There were young recruits who had barely seen combat. There were sailors who preferred to be on their ships, not in trenches. But they all shared something: the determination to fight to the end. The letters these soldiers wrote to their families during the siege reveal a strange mixture of desperation and pride. They knew the war was lost, but they also knew they were making history. One soldier wrote to his wife, "Tomorrow we attack. I don't know if I'll come home, but I know I'll give everything I have." The Allies never expected the Germans to have enough supplies for such an operation. But Frisius had been accumulating ammunition for months. He had rationed food, recycled metal to make grenades, converted every building in Dunkirk into a war warehouse. The preparation had been meticulous. During the battle, the Canadians found themselves fighting against some of the most experienced German soldiers of the entire war. These weren't desperate recruits. They were veterans who had survived 5 years of conflict and knew exactly how to fight. Their tactics were precise, their movements coordinated, their determination absolute. The Czechs defending the southern sector were particularly surprised by the ferocity of the attack. They had expected a slow and predictable war of attrition. Instead, they found themselves in the middle of a World War I-style battle, with frontal assaults, hand-to-hand combat, and massive artillery. It was like going back in time. German communications intercepted during the operation reveal the mentality of these soldiers. They didn't talk about winning the war, because they knew that was impossible. They talked about honor, about fulfilling their duty, about demonstrating that the German army could fight until its last breath. It was a different motivation, but equally powerful. Frisius himself became a legendary figure during these last days of war. At 50 years old, he was an experienced commander who had served in both world wars. He could have surrendered honorably at any time. He didn't fight with a bayonet in the trench, but his mere presence within the Dunkirk bastion, his refusal to surrender and his absolute control of every military decision made him a symbol of stubborn resistance. While the Third Reich collapsed, Frisius continued organizing defenses, distributing supplies and launching attacks. He led from the very center of the siege, sharing the risks and confinement with his men, determined to resist until the end. The contrast between what was happening in Dunkirk and the rest of Europe was surreal. While Frisius planned his attack, Nazi leaders were hiding or fleeing. While his soldiers advanced against Allied lines, other German armies were surrendering en masse. It was as if this small fortress existed in a parallel dimension. Allied intelligence reports from that time show the total confusion the operation caused. Analysts couldn't understand why the Germans were attacking when they clearly had no hope of changing the war's outcome. Some thought it was a distraction to allow other Nazi officers to escape. The truth was simpler and more complex at the same time. Frisius and his men attacked because it was what they knew how to do. They had been soldiers for years, had defended impossible positions before, and didn't know how to surrender. For them, fighting was more natural than surrender, even when logic dictated otherwise. When the war finally ended and Frisius handed over his sword, the mutual respect between enemies was evident. Allied commanders recognized they had faced exceptional soldiers. The Germans recognized they had fought against worthy opponents. In the midst of war's tragedy, something resembling military honor had emerged. Today, Dunkirk is a peaceful city on the French coast. Tourists visit the beaches where the famous 1940 evacuation occurred, but few know the story of the last German attack of 1945. The trenches were filled in, the bunkers demolished, and life continued. But for a moment in April 1945, this city became again the center of a battle the world believed impossible. Operation Blücher reminds us that history is full of moments where individuals make decisions that defy all logic. Frisius could have surrendered with honor in September 1944. His soldiers could have refused to attack in April 1945. But they chose to write one last page of resistance, and that's why their story deserves to be remembered as the last roar of an army that refused to die in silence. If you like this story, give it a like, comment and subscribe. See you in the next video.